All right, good evening, everyone. I'm Kathleen Barker with the National Council for History Education. Joining me is my colleague, Shauna, and we are very pleased tonight to bring you a webinar with Paul Ortiz, who is so very accomplished. I'm going to give him a very brief introduction, but Paul Ortiz is professor of history at the University of Florida, where he teaches undergraduate courses and supervises fields in a number of topics, including African American history and Latino, Latinx history, social history, history of social movements, oral history, digital humanities, and ethnography. He is the author of many books, including this one, An African American and Latinx History of the United States, which received the 2018 Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Award for Literary Excellence. Dr. Ortiz is also a National Archives Distinguished Scholar for the 2022-23 year, concentrating in Latinx history. Dr. Ortiz is also the director of the award-winning Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida. He uses oral history in a lot of his work, and I'm really excited to say that the Proctor program has led many fieldwork excursions to places like the Mississippi Delta, where students have collected and interviewed veterans of the Civil Rights Movement. The program is also the national repository for the 2017 Women's March on Washington archive, which is very cool. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Ortiz. Welcome.
Thank you, Kathleen, for a very kind introduction. And I'm real honored to be here with you all this evening. Talking to you from Florida. You know, Florida has been in the news a lot for education. I'm also honored to be the outgoing president of the United Faculty of Florida, University of Florida chapter. Our chapter is a combined AFT and NEA chapter. And you might be interested to note also that this morning we filed a suit in the Northern District of Florida, federal court district, against the state of Florida for its efforts to try to destroy our union. And we filed that suit with the Florida Education Association, our colleagues in K through 12 education throughout Florida. And our argument is that, and this is very apropos of our topic tonight, that the United Faculty of Florida and FEA, we're the main organizations. It's interesting to think about collective bargaining this way. We're the main organizations now that uphold ethnic studies, Latino studies, Black studies, gender studies in the state of Florida. And we do that through our collective bargaining agreements, through our academic freedom articles. And that's how we've kept things like gender studies, like critical race theory, like studies of systemic inequality. That's how we've kept them alive in the face of so much opposition from the higher ups, if you will. So it's doubly ironic that I'm here with you this evening. I have to make a fair admission. I was not the best high school student or even K through 12 student. You know, where I grew up, college was just not given to us as an option. And I'm a third generation military veteran. And I grew up in a shipyard town, Bremerton, Washington, across the Puget Sound from Seattle, of course. And so, you know, going into the military and really growing up in the tail end of the Vietnam War was all we knew. And so I grew up with hearing about elders who, after our family had fled from Mexico in 1914 during the revolution, I mean, we went right away. And so I had elders who served in World War I, World War II, of course, Korea, Vietnam. My time was I was in U.S. Special Forces in Central America in the mid 80s. And I mention this because this was really the pathway that got me excited and really into history. Because as I mentioned earlier, I was a very mediocre K through 12 student by and large. And because, you know, growing up in a working class environment and not really having that, you know, my parents really couldn't help us with homework. Either they were working or it was just too much. My father often double shifted at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. retired with a lung, and he was a military retiree also, retired with a lung full of asbestos and Agent Orange poisoning. And so our parents really didn't have the capacity to spend time with us to help us with things like school work. So I'm very grateful to be here today. And because of institutions like unions, like the civil rights movement, like the Chicano movement, movement organizations that really made it possible for people like me, especially the civil rights movement, that made it possible for Chicano, African American, and women to be in higher education. Period. So that's kind of my personal introduction. So I wanted to share with you a little bit of a workshop setting that I do with school districts throughout the country. And I work with a lot of school districts, some of which are beginning to adopt an African American Latinx history of the United States. And you'll be glad to know that Beacon Press is working on a young adult version of African American Latinx history just because of the demand among high school, middle school students. The state of Connecticut has recently mandated that students graduating from that system, the K through 12 system in Connecticut, the public system, will take a sequence of courses on Puerto Rican, Latinx, and African American history. That comes about by student demand. This is also the case in California, some parts of the Southwest. I work with school districts in Maryland, in Indiana, and other parts of the country where, and some of this isn't even mandated. Some of this are decisions made by administrators, superintendents who say, Professor Ortiz, my district is transitioning from into a minority majority situation. That is, the majority of our students are students of color. They're Asian American, African, Latino, Caribbean, Eastern European. We need a more diverse kind of tapestry of history than we've had before. And so this is where I really love working with school districts on these types of histories. I'm going to transition over to share with you some slides that I typically use with school districts who are looking for people, we're calling them tonight heroes, right? To really plug into narratives. And what we've discovered is that students really want, it's great. I love themes. I'm a social historian, but people really do need individuals. They need groups, they need movements to kind of hang their hats on, and if you were. So one of the questions in the chat I want to address before I go over into the presenter mode is from Christopher, and asks, with Florida's recent anti-immigrant legislation and the war against Disney, you have to wonder about the devastating impact this will all have on the people and economics of the state. And yes, it's having an impact, and I see it with my students. I just turned in my final grades on Monday. Now I'm transitioning to write letters of recommendation. A big part of my job as a professor, I didn't know this in advance, but is writing letters of recommendation pretty much nonstop and talking to HR folks in firms and companies and trying to help my students get to the next level, get a foot in the job market. And it's becoming an issue. And, when I talk to HR people throughout the country, and I mentioned Florida, there's a pause now, people, oh, Florida, oh, tell us about what's happening down there. That's a problem, because what it means is that we're beginning to be singled out as an outlier state. I'm not saying we're the only state that's having these issues with this struggle over critical race theory and gender studies and other fields. But if this continues, this kind of cultural war, that it will have, it has had negative effects. We have an epic school teacher shortage, by the way. You're probably aware of that, K through 12 teachers. Many of my colleagues throughout the state of Florida, leaving Florida, going to other parts of the country. For me, because I have a CBA, collective bargaining agreement, I'm staying put. It's really exciting down here. So let me get, and we can talk about it a little more in Q&A, but let me get over to shared screen, and I'm going to show you some slides. And again, I want to just take you through a kind of a a presentation that I do for school districts. And let me. So heroes and leaders in Latinx history, and what do we mean by this? Even the term Latinx, and it's been fascinating to me because I've been a university professor now for about 21 years. And even the terms that we've used to describe who we are as peoples have changed pretty radically in my lifetime. I was born in 1964. I'm just old enough to remember when even the term Chicano to refer to Mexican Americans of the 60s and 70s was still kind of edgy. There are tensions in my family about that term. And then when that got accepted, almost as the moment it gets accepted, then you have Latino in the 90s. And that term was very edgy for a long time too. And then that gets accepted. And now we have Latinx. And that's a term that my students really embrace. And I want to explain when the title African American and Latinx History of the United States, for those of you that have had the chance to look at the book, you'll see I put a little bit of my life history in there, but I wanted to share with you that my students really chose the title of that book. Originally, it was going to be something like African American and Latina History. My students said, please make a Latinx. And the reason is that my students like the term, and not just my students, but I work with a lot of labor unions too on labor history workshops. So younger labor organizers and people, in the late teens and late 20s, like the term because it's a pan-Latino term. We used to call this pan-Hispanic. That is, you can talk about Cubans, you can talk about Dominicans, you can talk about Mexicans, you can talk about Haitians, and they all kind of fit together under this term without giving up their own distinctive identities. So I don't have to give up the term Chicano to use the term Latinx. But if I want to talk about the experiences of Mexican cotton pickers in Arizona in the 1910s, alongside of their Puerto Rican comrades who also are picking cotton in Arizona, working on Goodyear land or Goodrich land for the big tire companies, I can use a term like Latinx to bring those groups together in kind of a historical sense. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about the terminology, because I know in some cases that's become a big topic of debate. So my 2 busiest months of the year, if you ask my family and my friends, they're like, don't try to schedule anything with Paul during Hispanic Heritage Month or during Black History Month. And one of the exciting things, though, is how those 2 months are really beginning to come together. And the bridge between September, the middle of September, when many of our great liberation struggles in Latin America and the Caribbean were waged, and Black History Month. In February, the bridge is really Martin Luther King Jr. National Day of Commemoration. And so it's really exciting as a historian. And now we have Juneteenth, my gosh. And now we have Cinco de Mayo, which is becoming much more meaningful as a historical commemoration. So being a historian now, I'm like, I feel like I'm in heaven, y'all. I mean, I'm just like, this is so cool to be a historian at this present. And especially in the wake of the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement in the spring of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd and the great global movement that arose in response to that, there's much more of a sense of people wanting to learn our histories, and especially how those histories intersect with each other. So it's great to teach the history of my people, but I want to know increasingly, and the high school students I work with, the younger labor organizers I work with, in some of these different campaigns, like the Starbucks campaign or the Chipotle campaign or what have you. They want to learn how Black and brown people and Asian people and Pacific Islander people have intersected throughout the centuries. So it's very exciting to see that, but it's very much pushed by a movement, in this case, the Black Lives Matter movement. In the 60s, it was the Third World Liberation Movement. It was the Civil Rights Movement. It was the farm worker movement, which really pushed into being what we now call the ethnic studies movement within higher ed and within some high schools and middle schools. So the first panel here is Hispanic Heritage Month. And you may or may not know who any of these individuals are, but they all at one point or the other played an important role in Hispanic history. And so it's not unusual. This is how I start my lectures on Hispanic Heritage Month with these four individuals. Now, let me transition to how I start Black History Month. So it's not a sleight of hand. I'm not a magician, but you'll notice that it's the exact same panel. And what I'm trying to emphasize here is that when we think of people like Ida B. Wells Barnett or Antonio Maceo, Reverend Lena Mason, or Jose Marti, there's so many ways in which these individuals are distinct to the time and the places that they lived in, but there's also many ways in which they intersect so richly with each other. And what I mean by this is that Jose Marti was a person who was very concerned with anti-Black lynching. And so you have Cuba's greatest patriot who is fighting his whole life against Spanish tyranny in Cuba. He's exiled. He lives in Mexico for a time. And my wife and I were able to actually visit the flat where he stayed when he was in Mexico City. It was an amazing experience. And he becomes concerned about the oppression of Black people in the United States. And he writes about lynchings that occur, and he's writing in Spanish, of course. He's writing for a Latin American audience, and he's saying that we need to concern ourselves with the struggles of the Negro peoples in the United States. If we don't, what kind of people are we that would only be concerned about our own issues? If we don't concern ourselves with the struggles of our brothers and sisters in in North America, as he called it, then we're betraying our own principles of solidarity, of mutual aid. And so this is why I love to start with these four individuals. Reverend Lena Mason, if you've read African American Latinx history, you'll know that she's a great Black Christian evangelical minister in the late 19th century who takes time out to write about the Cuban liberation struggle, and especially the role that Cuban women are playing in the 1880s and 1890s, taking up arms, fighting alongside men, serving under General Antonio Maceo, pictured on the left. Ida B. Wells Barnett gives a eulogy to General Maceo in Chicago after his death during the Cuban War of Liberation. So all four of these individuals connected together. I wanted to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because if you've been following the news in Florida, you know that diversity, equity, and inclusion are very controversial. In fact, the early iteration of House Bill 999 actually included a ban on all diversity, equity, and inclusion inflected programs, including classes, majors, colleges, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing I want to share with you today is that corporations right now are the place where diversity, equity, and inclusion are really practiced in many ways much more effectively and pervasively, in some cases in universities. And I'm giving you this whole panel here. I do a lot of talks for different groups, right? And so if you see here, this was a talk on intersectionality. And you see the groups that sponsor me for this talk, and the payoff here, I would have blocked out if I had more time. I have another slide where I block out who the sponsor is, but the sponsor for this particular lecture on intersectionality, on Latinx history, diversity, on the importance of heritage, the sponsor for my talk in this case was ConAgra Corporation, a multi-billion-dollar food company. And this is very typical. Microsoft, Cognizant, Guggenheim Partners, Deutsche Bank. I give talks to all these types of corporations, and for them, diversity, intersectionality, the themes here, what Latinx people are contributing beyond assimilation. In other words, we don't just come to the US and assimilate to a dominant culture. We never do that completely. We change the culture, right? You don't, as Dr. King taught us, you don't assimilate when you find injustice, in this case, anti-immigrant hysteria or oppression of migrant farm workers. You try to change the system so that you don't leave behind an unjust system. That's what this corporation asked me to talk about. They asked me to talk about overcoming oppression, right? And so I think it was very, very interesting. This is a table of contents for African American Latinx history of the United States. And I think the reason that the book has become so popular, it's not necessarily anything that I've done. It's against the moment, it's the time we live in. People in my classrooms in Florida, I have a lot of Haitian American students. I have a lot of Cuban American students. I have a lot of Mexican American students, and many of them are first generation students. And they want to see their peoples, their families in the historical narrative. And they want to see them there, as my Cuban students tell me on a regular basis. Did we have a history before 1959? And I'm like, yes, you did. You had a proud history before, after, during 1959. So let's talk about the 19th century and the integral ways in which Cuba is at the forefront of so many minds in the United States, and also Haiti, the Haitian Revolution, the Mexican War of Independence. I'll get more into that in a moment. I wanted to give you a little bit of the table of contents here. In terms of primary sources, I'll kind of defer to an African American Latinx history of the United States. But I want us to think, when we think about primary sources, murals, paintings, graffiti, tagging, people who are from Latin America, from the Caribbean, all bring distinctive public, what I'll call here public history cultures. The idea after the Mexican Revolution, for example, the state supported public mural artists. These are just two of the more famous ones, but there were hundreds of others. The idea is that schools are great, classrooms are wonderful, libraries are terrific, but unless we get this knowledge and promote it out of doors, and more than just knowledge, experience, analysis, unless we get it out where people are, then what are we really doing? And so throughout much of the 20th century, if you were in downtown Mexico City, or what we call the historical center of the city, of the federal city, you could run into murals like this. Now they have been taken indoors, right? Climate controlled and preservation, et cetera, et cetera. But there are new generations of younger muralists in East Los Angeles, in Overtown in Miami, in San Antonio, Texas, in Dallas, Fort Worth, that create our people's histories out of doors. So I want to encourage you, if you're thinking about, 20th, 21st century Latinx histories, to think about the visual. Also, something I'm not really able to cover as much in this presentation because I didn't think about this until just now, poetry. And I want us to think about the fact that Martin Espada, perhaps the greatest living poet in this country, Puerto Rican, but writes, again, poetry, and just won the National Book Award last year, by the way, writes poetry which brings together Latinx, Puerto Rican, Cuban, African, Irish experiences. One of his greatest poems is juxtaposing the Irish struggle for liberation during the Easter Rebellion of 1916 in Ireland, what becomes the Republic of Ireland, with the Puerto Rican struggle for autonomy and independence from the United States. And Martin Espada has a whole range, and he has spoken word. You can get these on CD or download them. My students love his voice, the cadence. He has a poem called Jorge the Custodian quits his job, and it's about working class experiences. The way I teach Latinx history, by the way, and I realize Latinx history is an enormously big field, but we each have distinctive ways of teaching it and researching. So my approach is really seeing the diversity of Latinx peoples throughout the centuries, throughout the different cultures, the different languages, the different religions, the different political beliefs, is that there is this diversity, yes, But when you get to the bottom of it, we are predominantly a working class people. That is, we either work on the land, we work in a factory, we work in a restaurant, we work in a construction site, or we're just one generation removed from that experience, and we still have siblings or parents who work in those types of industries, like I did when I was growing up. And so that working class experience is an important kind of common denominator here. I'm not going to read this quote. It's obviously a very painful quote for me to read, but it gets to an element of the ways in which Latinx people have always been viewed in this country. We've been viewed as workers. How much are we going to contribute to the wealth of this country? And that puts us in a comparative framework with the African American experience. African Americans have also been defined predominantly as workers. Both groups have been defined as workers first, citizens maybe second, maybe third, right? In this case, George Clements, a very powerful businessman who's basically saying that thank heavens for the Mexicans. He's saying this early in the during World War II, or actually before World War II. Thank heavens for the Mexican people because they're tractable. They don't give us any problems. They're ignorant. They're not interested in becoming citizens, but man, they work hard. Thank good. And I could give you thousands of these quotes from the most powerful business people in the United States of America from about 1880 to 1945. After the end of World War II, people just get less honest, and they rarely say these types of things out in public, even though they believe them privately. The hateful sign on the left, no Negroes, dogs, Mexicans, that's my father's generation. That's what he grew up with. Those are the signs that greeted him. He worked in a restaurant that had a very typical, he was a busboy, as they called him back then. And he had one of these signs in the restaurant he was working in. And I asked him, Dad, what impact did that have on you? Oral history is such an important source for Latinx history. Talking to our parents, our elders, our grandparents, an older lady on the block who looks out for the kids, who looks out for the neighborhood, interview them, talk to them, learn about where they came from. And I'd ask my old man, as we call him in the Chicano community, we refer to our fathers often, Dad, what was it like to grow up where you had these awful signs? And he'd say, Mio, it didn't bother me. They wouldn't even let me go through the front of the restaurant door anyway. We had to go around the back. So we never saw the sign really from the front. We saw it from the inside, and it was reverse, lettering, right? So it's this kind of way of using humor. And so I want us to think about, I'm still kind of in the art phase. I'm not an artist, obviously, but I want us to think about poetry, murals, music. Carlos Santana, for example, in my generation growing up, hearing his songs, what does it mean to play a song? And I play this for my students. Carlos Santana playing a song called Toussaint Louverture, which came out in his great Abraxas album, I think came out in 1970. Toussaint Louverture is not Mexican. Carlos Santana is Mexican. Toussaint Louverture was the leader of the Haitian Revolution. Why would Carlos Santana write a song dedicated to a Haitian revolutionary in his greatest album? There's reasons for that. And the reason is an attempt to create a unified kind of solidarity, an attempt to create bridges between different cultures, and especially within different freedom struggles. But we want to keep this quote by George Clements in mind. And I'm going to kind of take us next 10 minutes or so through kind of a roller coaster ride, because I'm from Florida, a roller coaster ride through history, and then we'll get to more questions and answers at the end of that. So again, murals, paintings, these are easily accessible. Mexico City is a city of museums. It's a city of galleries. Many of these now are online, or you can find them, Google Bing images, mixed feelings about that, obviously. But these are easily accessible images. I want us to kind of think about, in terms of Latinx history, how this image, this is from the Mexican War of Independence. The corollary would be the American Revolution if you were thinking about just the US. But think about images you've seen during the depicting the American Revolution and who is depicted as a freedom fighter. Now, now zoom into this image here, where you see a multicultural, multilingual, multi-class movement for freedom. You see powerful religious imagery, yes, Christian imagery, and then you see anarchist imagery right next to it. So in other words, the religious and the secular don't have to clash. In the case of the Mexican War of Independence, at least in this artist's imagination, Orozco was one of the greatest, there's a unified struggle between people of different classes for freedom from the Spanish Empire. And so what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to again suggest connections between the different revolutions, in this case, the Haitian Revolution, the Mexican War of Independence, and the ways in which the Mexican War of Independence opens up a new possibility of freedom for enslaved African Americans in the United States. A great primary source here to think about is the fact that a lot of really cool newspapers have been digitized. The Colored American is available through most university and a lot of college databases now. And you can have students going through the Colored American, and as time goes on from the 1820s, 1830s, in the Black press, you'll see increasing articles about Mexico. And that's part of my research, is how do African Americans see Mexicans and vice versa? And especially with this great space for liberation that Mexico opens up at a time when slavery is growing, is being grown and forced upon the North American continent by the US. What does it mean to have an anti-slavery nation like right next door? It leads to very dramatic politics. Another really cool source that's online now, I'm very jealous of my graduate students. You don't have to go to the National Archives or the Library of Congress now. There's the Founding Fathers online, and you can find much of this correspondence that I went through like physically, although I do now go to use Founding Fathers online. It's a great keyword database, by the way. You can get into the collections of John Adams, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. I found a letter which people often ask me, Professor Ortiz, what's the most exciting find you've ever made as a historian? And there's just so many. But this is one of my most favorites. This actually made me weep when I read it, because the original version is in Spanish. And I started reading this letter in Spanish, and I didn't know it was written by Jose Maria Morelos until I got to the end. Morelos was one of the great Mexican revolutionary generals of the War of Independence against the Spanish Empire. And I didn't know that he wrote these letters to President James Madison, but he's writing these letters to try to encourage the US to join in with the Mexican people to fight against their common European oppressor. And what made me weep about this is to think about the possibilities. Please, President Madison, say yes, just say yes. And of course, we know he says no. And the US has, because the US has a lot of designs on Mexico from the very beginning, especially the land, especially northern Mexico. And we will end up invading Mexico just a few decades later. But this letter, this attempt to create an alliance between Mexico and the US, just thinking how different history could have been if that relationship really could have been forged. But all was not lost. And I try to emphasize to my students and in my writings and lectures to corporations, to labor unions, to school districts, to university campuses, that the Mexican and Mexican American people have a long and proud history of freedom, being freedom fighters and being concerned about the freedom and the liberation of other peoples. And one of my favorite characters, Jose Manuel Gallegos, the first Hispanic elected to U.S. territorial legislature in Mexico. It's just a great illustration of this. A lot of our students are unaware of the fact that Arizona, when the Civil War broke out, the Civil War in the United States, that Arizona actually seceded from the Union and became a Confederate state, or Arizona Territory. New Mexico Territory considered the same course of action. And it would have went with Arizona to the Confederacy if not for this amazing cohort of Mexican political leaders who are now Mexican Americans, right? Because the US has invaded and has taken over Mexico. So now New Mexico is an American territory. It's not a state yet. But Jose Gallegos, when he was born, the place of real estate that he was on was Mexico. Like what we say as Mexican Americans is, we didn't cross the border crossed us. Jose Gallegos is Exhibit A. And what he's trying to tell his comrades, his counterparts in the New Mexican Territorial Assembly, and this is easily found online, by the way, is that our tradition as a people is anti-slavery. We will never join these traitors in the Confederacy. Our people believe in liberty. Our people believe in laws. Our people believe in a government where we have the right to make choices. The Confederates, the Anglo-Texans, believe in military despotism. That's the slave power. That's who we're against. For saying these words in public, and he spoke these before the entire territorial legislature, all in Spanish, by the way. This is an important thing. This is a fun kind of primary exercise to do, is to take these speeches, many of which you'll see in Spanish, some of which have been translated by now, and get our students to think about this, that there's more languages than English to think about freedom, right? And as far as I can tell, Jose Gallegos spoke maybe 5 words of English his entire life. He was primarily a Spanish speaker. And so he's talking to people about freedom and abolition and anti-slavery, but it's in Spanish. And it's a very proud, democratic type of language. We're seeing schools now, especially in California, where ethnic studies is very strong. We're recovering the histories of these lost Mexican-American abolitionists. One of them is Francisco Pío Ramírez. We mentioned earlier, I mentioned in terms of primary documents, El Clamor Público, which was his primary newspaper. He worked on some others, but this was the main one, has been digitized now. And you can find this through California state system libraries. And the articles on abolitionism, on anti-slavery are just very powerful. And I like to juxtapose Francisco Pío Ramírez with Frederick Douglass, who we all know or should know, but I want to put them in conversation with each other. What are the nuances? What are the similarities? What are some of the contrasts in how they think about internationalism, anti-slavery, freedom, equality? And I just think we have an opportunity now to give to our students a kind of excitement and a kind of intersectionality that we didn't have maybe as students. In terms of heroes and heroines for Latinx history, I can't think of a greater one than Dolores Huerta. And Dolores is a person who I've been honored myself as a former United Farm Worker organizer to actually know and to actually work under. Just the most courageous person and one of the greatest Americans who's ever lived. And anytime I can play I've had the privilege of interviewing her a few times, and we brought her to the University of Florida campus for Women's History Month 2 years ago. It was such an incredible experience. She joined us via Zoom. But a person whose life, and I'm not going to read this whole narrative, but who personifies the Latinx experience, working class, struggles against oppression, concern about others. Like, we love our neighborhoods, we love our families. Like, I always hear this stuff, Hispanic people, family is very important for the Hispanic people. That's an important theme. Well, yeah, that's true. But we don't define family as just our own biological family. If you look at a person like Dolores Huerta, she uses, and she didn't grow up being a farm worker, but she embraced the farm worker's struggle. And she used her stature as the foremost after Cesar Chavez, the foremost labor union organizer, to branch out into LGBTQ plus rights, women's rights, anti-poverty struggles, right? But she's had to pay a price. The age of 58, beaten severely by the police. And again, highlighting a very perennial theme in Latinx history, 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, or 2 steps sideways, right? Without, as to paraphrase Frederick Douglass, without struggle, there is no progress. So let me just run through a couple more slides and we'll open it up for questions and answers. But another very important figure in Latinx history, of course, is Sylvia Mendez. This is a case, Mendez versus Westminster, and her parents were heavily involved. And not just her parents, but many other Mexican and Puerto Rican parents in California and the Southwest, trying to get equal education for their Spanish-speaking children or their darker-skinned children. You had some cases, I've interviewed elders who were children during this case, and they would talk about how sometimes school districts in the Southwest would segregate in such a way that darker skinned siblings would be excluded from a school that lighter skinned siblings from the same family were allowed to attend. That is segregation in the Southwest, similar in some ways to segregation that African Americans were subjected to in the Southeast, but different. Okay, so there's an interesting comparison and contrast here between Black and Latino experiences. What I want to highlight here, though, is that, and there are many books about the Mendez versus Westminster case. It's seen as a very critical case pursuant to Brown v. Board of Education, abolishing separate, so-called separate but equal institutions in American life. But I would argue equally important is the story of the Mendez family and others who come together and who say it isn't just about us. It isn't just about my children. It isn't just about my family. We're fighting for civil rights for all. We're trying to improve the situation, the conditions for all people. This is why we form organizations like LULAC, like the United Farm Workers, like the NAACP, like the American Federation of Labor. It isn't just about us, right? It's about trying to improve the lives of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people at the same time. Sylvia Mendez has lived a life of service, not just thinking about herself, but thinking about a broader kind of imagined community, if you will. More recently, the fun part of writing African-American Latinx history was my publisher, Beacon Press, said, look, write a new kind of history of the US from about 1776 to present. When I finished the book, I think it was in 2017. So the present was pretty recent. The cool thing about this was my last chapter of the book, I was able to interview some of my former students who played a critical role in the largest general strike in the history of the Americas. And again, a great primary source if you're interested in movement history, Latinx history, labor history. Start an interview project in your, I know in Michigan, for example, the movement was very strong. In 2006, I think over 150,000 people went out in Detroit, left work, had a massive march, but many people in smaller towns also as well participated in the general strike. Interview people, find out what were you doing on May 1st, 2006? Why did you go on strike, or why didn't you not go on strike? What's exciting about this movement more recently is it's just kind of in many ways a continuation and a little bit of a discontinuity from traditional themes in Latinx history. If you're looking for heroes, by the way, now there are Latino women who are in the labor movement, rising through the ranks, becoming vice presidents, becoming presidents, becoming leaders of labor federations, and they're bringing their experiences from Mexico, from Central America, from the Caribbean, and reviving the contemporary labor movement. It's just so exciting and so thrilling to see. Now I can say that some of the women in these leadership positions, some of them are my former students, like Leilani Montez, who's a vice president of local 1199 healthcare East workers in New Jersey, a big local of 25,000, primarily immigrant women. Jolandi Lopez, custodian here, tells us, and this is from an oral history, but how rich is this imagery? And she shared this with us in the lead up to the general strike in 2006. And she said, Professor Ortiz, here's the thing. I know we're fellow union members. I was in the teachers union there, and she was in the AFSCME, the custodian, primarily custodian groundskeepers union in UC Santa Cruz. And she said, but you know what? She said, even though we're both union members of different unions, normally you don't see me. You don't see us. You don't see us cleaning your toilets. You don't see us preparing your food. You don't see us mowing the lawn or disinfecting a classroom for you. Normally, you don't see us. We consider that as workers without faces, we're the ghosts who clean, but never have any type of recognition. And it's only when we come together and do something dramatic, like a march or a strike or a sit down or a refusal to allow business to go on as planned. That's when you notice us. Isn't that interesting? So that was really a profound insight. And I'll conclude here again. I'm kind of wrapping up with the theme that I often start with, and you'll see Hispanic Heritage Month, October 18th, 2022. This was my opening slide for that radical organization called Alliant Capital, again, a corporation, not a union, not a school district. But the pitch I'm making here again is that if you're talking about Latinx histories and you're talking about the need to create new narratives about how we've impacted US history, you've got to start from the working class perspective and experiences. Emma Tenayuka, a person who my elders from San Antonio, I have a lot of San Antonio people in my family. She led a strike in the middle of the 1930s involving 11,000 workers in the pecan industry. And she was barely 20 years old. Imagine that. And it was a successful strike. And they ran up against police brutality, state violence, employer intransigence, and it succeeded. And she became a beloved figure in the Chicano community as she got older. Of course, Cesar Chavez, you probably have heard of. He was a person who I learned from. I never had the honor to meet him directly, as I met Dolores and other senior organizers. And these are individuals who, by the way, all had flaws. And as teachers, I think it's important for us to present these characters as people who did the best they possibly could against incredible, almost insurmountable odds. But we're human beings, right? They made mistakes. They got older. Sometimes they couldn't replicate successes they had earlier in life. But nonetheless, they're people who should be revered, I believe. So I think what I'll do now, if it's okay with folks, is I'll stop this share and open it up to, I'll look in the chat bar, Kathleen, I think, well, a lot of things in the chat bar. Very cool. And I'm happy to share this presentation too, y'all. I can send it to you tonight even. I think maybe to Kathleen, and so that you'll have it, it's all public access.
That's perfect. If you send it to us, we can share with everyone.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going down the chat bar and a lot of really cool statements. History that only paints black and white, and to separatist mindset to continue. Yeah. One of the exciting things is I'm asked frequently now to talk to Puerto Rican, Mexican American community organizations, Black history groups, and increasingly those groups are asking me to talk about these other experiences. So Black history groups often ask me to talk about, bring in Latino history. We want to learn immigration history. We want to incorporate that into what we know. The Latino groups are increasingly asking me to talk about Black history, bring that in. And then, of course, there's many Afro-Latino peoples in the United States and North America, millions. In fact, one of my most recent PhD students is just starting a tenure track assistant professorship in Afro-Latinx history. That blows my mind because, again, when I was a student, that was not an option, but it should have been there all along. We saw a lot of art similar to this in New Mexico, Santa Fe, Albuquerque, very good in the Southwest. Again, muralism, outdoor art. We didn't talk about pottery, ceramic art for indigenous peoples, for African peoples. Pottery, very, very important. There's ways in which those communities continue to keep alive those traditions of ceramics. More languages, this thing about freedom, and then in English. Well, I didn't talk about Brazil. I have Brazilian students who always remind me, Professor Ortiz, don't forget about our histories here, or from Brazil too. Viva la Causa video, teaching hard history. Yeah, that's a really good one. I haven't seen that in a long time. There's a lot of good. Oh, I wanted to share with you now. So I'm a consultant narrator. Many of you are no doubt familiar with the incredible work of the actor John Leguizamo. And John Leguizamo is actually, he has a popular series right now. And then also in late August, there's the first ever Latinx history themed docuseries that he's the senior producer of, and it's dropping August 29th. So as schools kind of come back into session, look to your local PBS channel, and you get to see yours truly, talking about history stuff, Latinx history stuff, really from the American Revolution onwards. Will you be at the NEA? No, unfortunately, no. I will not be able to make the NEA. We're kind of nailed down here right now because of the lawsuit. There's a lot of stuff we have to do here to do that. So I'm looking at now the question from Kelly. I really appreciate how you weave our shared and different experiences to talk about different movements. I often find myself trying to make sure I don't hijack or crowd out other marginalized groups by others sharing the Black experience during Latinx, Arab American, and Asian American Pacific Islander Month. Did you organically land in your opening for leaders, or did you set out to find 4 people that tied everybody together? No, that just came about after actually writing African American Latinx histories, and then looking at my research database and seeing how many places that Lena Mason, who most people I didn't know about until I started doing the research, how she connects to Antonio Maceo. Now, did I ever imagine that a Black woman evangelical minister in the upper Midwest would connect with a Cuban liberation general in Cuba? No, I never imagined that in a million years. But it just turns out that I think that they should be, yes, see them as distinct individuals that had lived their own lives. They had families, they grew up in communities and neighborhoods. So certainly understand them, but understand that's only one dimension of their lives and experiences. Antonio Maceo spent time in Haiti. He learned so much about the Haitian Revolution. If he could have lived longer, I believe he would have talked more about the connections between Haitians and Cuban people. And so, yeah, I think it is possible to think about different groups of people in tandem. Here's the thing. I'm often asked as a movement historian, a group will ask me to come in and talk to like a neighborhood. Now this is mainly through Zoom. And they'll say, we're trying to create a coalition with the people in the next neighborhood. Sometimes it's interracial group. Sometimes it's maybe a predominantly white group trying to reach out to a predominantly Black group or predominantly Puerto Rican group trying to reach out to a predominantly Mexican-American group. But the first question I'll ask them is not, do you know the history of those other people across the way? Do you know your own people's movement history? And if the answer is no, my advice is learn that first. Get some grounding where you're from, where your peoples have fought and struggled for. And then think about going across the street, because you don't want to go into a coalition without anything, kind of empty-handed, if you will. Let me get to some other questions. It's my understanding that the distinction of Hispanic is relatively new and was born out of a marketing technique. Previously, people were either Black or white. Is that accurate? Not quite. So Hispanic is something I actually grew up with as a term. It develops in the census. And actually in Florida, by the way, Hispanic is still very popular. When I first moved here in 2008, the term Hispanic was pretty ubiquitous to talk about Cubans, Dominicans, Mexicans. Now it's receding in popularity here. And again, Latinx is, or Latino is kind of taking its place as a pan-Latino type of term. But originally, and then we also have in Spanish, Hispano, which is still very popular in the Southwest, as Hispanic is also very popular in New Mexico. So it depends on what part of the country you're in. For me as an outsider, when I talk to community groups, I respect their distinctions. If a group from the South Bronx asks me to come and do a thing and they say, we define ourselves as Latinx, that's the term I go with. If they define themselves as Puerto Rican, then that's the term I go with. As an outsider, I feel it's very important to respect the rights of communities and individuals to choose their own, distinctions. Let me see, going down, question from Mark. I spent a lot of time talking to my sixth graders about current events and making connections to their lives. Any advice for discussing Title 42 tomorrow? Question from Marcia. Do you have any resources for Underground Railroad to Mexico? There are increasingly, there are really good sources about this. Chapter 2 in African American Latinx history, I have a chapter about that talks about the Underground Railroad to Mexico. There's also newer books as well that talk more about the role of Mexico and abolitionism. So I can get some of those sources too as well. As an elementary teacher, if you could choose which people to profile for Latinx Month, who would you suggest? I like, well, I'm biased, but I think Dolores Huerta is a really good person because she's accessible. You can find really powerful audio video clips of her to play for your students. She's very compelling as a speaker, very committed, very dedicated, very passionate, very vocal. It's very important, I think, as a role model, especially for younger people, to see a woman who is pushing 94 now, who's not slowed down one iota. So I think she's a very important person. I also mentioned Representative Gallegos earlier. I think he's another powerful figure. He's been forgotten. I mean, I didn't grow up learning about this tradition of Mexican and Mexican-American abolitionists. I didn't know we had any connection to slavery or anti-slavery until I got into the archives and started studying this. And then when you start, when your eyes are open, as mine were, not too long ago, by the way, all of a sudden you see things anew. In chapter 4, I talk about in African American Latinx history, what I call the Cuban solidarity movement, which was started primarily by Black people in the United States to build solidarity to the Cuban War of Liberation during Reconstruction here, during the 1860s and 1870s. And again, very important for minorities to emphasize our cultural distinctions. Everyone is not just Black or white, regardless of the dominant populace. It is insulting. That's very true. And again, our students don't live in that world anymore, if they ever, in fact, did. I didn't grow up in a Black and white world. I grew up in a world where, on the West Coast, Mexican Americans had distinctive cultures, neighborhoods. we weren't even an intermediate people sometimes, and I don't like that as a historian and as a comparative race and ethnic studies scholar. I think that there's important. Anyway, are there folks that want to like ask questions? I'm going down the chat bar as quickly as I can. But Kathleen, are there any folks that want to kind of vocalize things as we're wrapping up, or?
There I am. I know it is. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So I think we can end our formal presentation. If you want to maybe hang out for another minute or two, we can do that. But
Sure.
I wanted to thank everyone for being here. Thank you, Dr. Ortiz, for being here, for a very informative and engaging presentation. Anyone who is interested, we have another webinar tomorrow night where we're talking about a mutiny on an 18th century trading vessel that was involved in trading all sorts of goods. At that. So join us tomorrow night at 7:30 for Jared Hardesty's webinar. And thank you again very much.
Thank you. This was great. I feel bad. There were so many great questions and comments in the chat bar. I was trying to keep up with them. Really engaged group.